On today's World Insight, the U.S. midterms are just 4 weeks away. Is it all down to the economy and inflation, or will issues like abortion rights crop up? And how can the Democrats keep their razor-thin majorities in both the House and the Senate?
If we're simply looking at the economy, it's bad news for Democrats. People don't feel that they're doing as well.
And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The upcoming U.S. November election will determine how far President Joe Biden and the Democratic Party can push their legislative agenda. A majority loss in the Senate and Congress would bear down on the Biden administration. Candidates are vying for positions up and down the ticket, from congressional seats to U.S. senators, all in the ballots on Election Day, November the 8th. U.S. voters look at abortion rights, high inflation, crime rates, and the Russian-Ukraine conflict in casting their votes. For outsiders looking into the U.S. election, what should we watch out for? How will the election outcome affect world affairs? Let's loop in our panelists. For the U.S. midterm election, all of them joining us from Washington, D.C., Bruce Fein, constitutional lawyer, former Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan. Rick Dunham, Director of the Global Business Journalism Program, a veteran political journalist. Brandon Andrew, entrepreneur and former Hill staffer. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. 1 month to go. What do you see are likely to be the strengths coming from both parties in the midterm election? Rick.
Well, right now, I think that the Senate is up for grabs, and it could go either way. Right now, it's 50-50, and it could go either way by a couple of seats. The House is likely to go Republican, but the trends right now are not as strong for the Republicans as historically, where the party out of power tends to gain significantly. Right now, it looks like Republicans have a slight advantage, but it's not a big wave. At least that's what it's looking like.
Brandon.
When you look at consumer prices month over month as compared to 1 year prior, still being 8 to 9% higher, when you look at the fact that interest rates are rising. So if people want to borrow money, if people want to use credit cards for holiday spending, if people want to buy a house, these prices are higher. And so, yes, I think Democrats are certainly performing a lot better than historically the party in power would be performing. However, there's some significant economic headwinds that could certainly curtail any positive momentum that the Democrats have.
Bruce, your thoughts?
Well, I agree in general, but I would underscore, I believe that the electorate is very volatile. I think there's a pox on both parties' attitude for a large number of Americans. There wasn't any dramatic change when Biden replaced Mr. Trump with regard to spending or otherwise. The Ukrainian attack by Putin has escalated inflation and interest rates, so mortgages are out of possibility for a great number of Americans at present. I think the imponderables are between now and Election Day that could shift the momentum in favor of the Democrats would be a foreign policy crisis. That could be Putin using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. We decide to attack Iran that claims they now have a nuclear weapon.
So you think only October surprises would be able to bring the Democratic Party a surprise win? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. Now let's go to some of the issues. What really counts is the economy every time, midterm election and presidential election. Is it going to be the same this time? Rick, and looking at the economy in the U.S., inflation and also unemployment, as well as the potential possibility of some kinds of recession, what does that mean for politics on both sides?
Well, let me say, if we're simply looking at the economy, it's bad news for Democrats. people don't feel that they're doing as well as they were 2 years ago or 6 years ago. People are worried about high prices, even though the gasoline prices have come down from the very top. But you see grocery prices, and especially as Bruce and Brandon were saying, the interest rates have made a lot of things more expensive and made it much harder for younger people to buy houses. So people don't feel so good about the economy, which is always bad for the president's party. I just quickly want to say that the one imponderable is Donald Trump. He has inserted himself into this campaign, and Democrats are right now, when I'm looking at ads, they're running against two things, against Donald Trump and against the U.S. Supreme Court for its decision to eliminate the constitutional right to choose abortion. So what's really interesting to me is that Democrats are really not running on the economy at all. They're running away from the economy, and they're running on these other issues. They're running against Donald Trump, while the Republicans are running on economy and crime.
That is really an interesting issue. What role will Donald Trump and also his followers play on the scene of midterm election just a month from now? Brandon.
Over and over again, history has shown that if there's more people getting out to vote, if the electorate is larger, if it's a larger percentage of the American population, then that, generally speaking, is going to favor Democrats over Republicans, or at least it has.
Okay.
The question, though, is, are Trump's candidates actually going to be competitive? In some places,
What do you think?
yes. In a lot of places, no.
What do you mean by no?
Well, and many of his candidates weren't able to make it through the Republican primary process. Some of them that were able to make it through the primary process, quite frankly, looking at their record and how they're running now, many Republicans would prefer someone else be there. And so the question is that stamp of endorsement from Donald Trump actually going to lead to competitiveness and wins at the ballot?
Yeah.
And if it's not, then I think that also impacts Democrats' ability to get out the vote, because if he's the big foil, but he's not actually effective in terms of getting people elected, then it is not going to motivate people to vote.
Bruce, your thoughts on the role of Donald Trump?
Well, I think it's not as pronounced as maybe has been insinuated. I think it's true in some states, but not in others. Take Georgia, where President Trump opposed the incumbent governor and Secretary of State because they insisted Georgia's vote was correct and not fraudulent. And they both were renominated despite President Trump's opposition. That's just one example. So President Trump has had an overall, positive success rate in the primaries, but it's not, like I would call a total steamroller here. And I do think that people are going to be voting against the Democrats more because of inflation. They say the interest rates, crime issues, even immigration, which is out of control, whether for good or for ill. The number of undocumented coming across the borders hitting record levels, irrespective of whether Trump says anything at all. So he's a factor, but I don't think dispositive.
But we do notice that he has been doing quite a number of political ads for the candidates that he is in favor of, with some of the messages that some of you suggest as extreme. Now, Rick, what would that mean? How do you see this individual, both as an individual and also as what some call a dividing factor in U.S. politics for the past few years?
Well, to me, this is almost always the midterm election. The first midterm of a presidency is about the current president. Almost nobody is mentioning Joe Biden. The president they're talking about is Donald Trump, who's been gone.
Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
Okay, it's for Republicans. I think it's a mixed bag. It's good in one way. He charges up the Republican base. I mean, the Republican turnout will be higher because of Donald Trump, and especially the right wing and the Christian right of the Republican Party. But his candidates that he pushed for in the primary, and he won more than 75% of the primaries he got involved in. Some of them are extreme and some of them are weak candidates. I mean, the Republicans could lose in some states that they should have been winning easily, like Ohio, and then his candidates in other states like Arizona and Pennsylvania have hurt the Republicans' chances. They beat more establishment candidates who probably would have been leading right now, but his candidates are running behind. So it's a mixed bag.
What about issues? There were earlier talks about the Republican Party suggesting on the candidate quality, the candidates and the issues. Are they really sincere about the issues, or are they just trying to be elected no matter what? There were different debates about that from both parties. Bruce, what about that capability, both for the Republican Party and for the Democratic Party?
Well, the Republican Party, I believe, has the greater crisis because a very substantial percentage of their candidates continue to insist, with no evidence that survived over 60 cases in courts of law, that the election was stolen, it's invalid, and that President Biden is not a legitimate president. That is, they've taken up arms against the process by which we have a peaceful transfer of power. That is one of the reasons why Lynn Cheney, she lost her primary in Wyoming, has basically started campaigning oftentimes for Democrats. It seems to me that's just a bridge too far to find any kind of alliance between those different segments, if you will, of the Republican Party. I know the senator from Nebraska, Ben Sasse, is leaving the party and probably leaving the Senate, going to the University of Florida for that reasoning, among others.
Yeah.
So I do believe that within the Republican Party, there's nitroglycerin that's going to force it to blow up. The Democrats, I believe that you have, again, a young group, more progressive, if you will, liberal, that's totally opposed to Nancy Pelosi. A good example was her refusal to push forward on a bill that would prohibit any stock trading by any members of Congress. And the Democrats, I believe, are divided between those who just want to stay in power and have no ideas. I think that's the majority, the establishment view. And the younger ones who would like to push the U.S. government into a more liberal direction, socialist direction, if you will, more government involvement in the economy and health and otherwise. I don't necessarily support that, but I believe the Democrats have a divided party as well. So I think we're in for a very, very tumultuous politics for the next several years.
I see. Rick, I want to ask you the same question. What about that capability for both parties?
Well, I think the Republicans have some advantages. I mean, on a lot of the issues, the views of Republican candidates are in the majority when it comes to crime, when it comes to immigration and the border, even when it comes to running the economy. Polls consistently all year have shown that voters side more with congressional Republicans. Democrats have really on their side when it comes to the major issues that people would care about, this issue of democracy, fundamental American democracy, and the issue of the Supreme Court and Roe versus Wade, overturning that. But Republicans, actually, Republicans, both the Trump and non-Trump Republicans, are united on a lot of issues. But as Bruce was saying, there's just this fundamental divide, which has to do with the reality of democracy and the reality of government by the people, for the people.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. see the difference.
Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. With us from Washington, D.C., Bruce Vying, Rick Dunham, Brandon Andrews. We're talking about the midterm election just a month from now in the U.S. If we could go one step further, looking at the election in 2014 and 2018, how would you compare this one with the earlier two? Is the country more divided, or having on its way to find some consensus politically? Bruce.
Well, I think the comparisons are useful. I do think that in general, a president confronts an opposition at midterm, in part because it's easier for people to be against something than for something. And Mr. Biden has given the voters a lot to be against. We've already enumerated them at some length. And it's customary that in a midterm, the party in the White House loses seats. And I do believe that is going very much against the Democratic Party. I think that we've seen a dress rehearsal of what's like to happen afterwards. When we had President Obama in the White House, Republican-controlled Congress, you have, in some sense, a logjam, a lot of legislation that's vetoed, resort to executive orders rather than legislation, executive agreements rather than treaties. And I think that we're going to be tied up in a similar kind of conflict between the executive and Congress as in this previous years. We already have many Republicans saying they're going to investigate the investigators of Trump in January 6th, thinking that the whole investigation has been fraudulent, including the January 6th committee. And that's going to create an enormous amount of distraction from addressing the mainstream issues that we've discussed with regard to the economy, jobs, inflation, immigration, and law enforcement.
So you're saying a grain of salt into the already divided country. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's exactly what's going to happen. It'll be worse in the outcome rather than better.
Rick, if we look at the money, politics is related to money. And it's very interesting just to look at the number. 2.5 billion US dollars have been raised for the midterm election. And that is already quite some percent of increase compared to 2014. It's only 200 million short of the 2018, even though we still have a month to go before the U.S. midterm election. What does that say money-wise?
There are a couple of trends this year that I think are fascinating. One is that Democrats in a lot of the contested races have more money. And a lot of the swing races, such as in Arizona and in Georgia in the Senate races. So that's one thing. The second is that Donald Trump is raising amazing amounts of money for someone who's technically not running for anything. And he has taken money that Republican establishment desperately needs to help its candidates for governor, to help its candidates for state legislature. So that is one trend. The second thing is dark money. And this is money that doesn't have to be reported until after the election, and sometimes not at all. Democratic dark money groups are actually, it looks like, spending more. They've reserved more television ad time than Republican groups in the final weeks of the campaign.
Dark money group, what do you mean? Just for our viewers who do not that familiar with politics.
Right, exactly. That is large contributors, wealthy people who don't want to be known who they are, but they can spend money to help defeat or elect candidates in the election. This was allowed by the Supreme Court in a decision about 20 years ago. And so Republicans have had a huge advantage over time in this kind of secret campaign contributions that overwhelm candidates sometimes at the end. And so this is in addition to the money that candidates themselves spend in their own campaigns. It's also why the amount of money spent in US elections has increased exponentially in this century. And so that's a different trend this time. The Democrats are competitive, and we don't actually know exactly what the messages are going to be that they try to push to turn out the Democrats, but they're going to have more money than they have had historically in these midterm elections.
Brandon, you served on the Hill. Of course, you know the relations between money and politics. To what extent could money help? To what extent it could also, shall I say, bring mixed message and baggage to the candidates?
Yeah, if you're able to fund your own campaign like a Michael Bloomberg, and the thought is that will bring more objectivity and that you will be less susceptible to influence from those donors, from in particular big money donors, in particular dark money that may be advocating for a particular issue. And so the thought is that it brings more objectivity, but again, that doesn't matter if you don't actually get elected. I subscribe to email fundraising newsletters from a range of candidates, a range of parties, not necessarily because I support the candidates, but because I like to study these things and I like to kind of keep track on, what's the latest approach that people are taking. However, just because a candidate is raising a lot of money doesn't necessarily mean that candidate is going to be successful if the other pieces to their campaign aren't put together.
I've been in Washington almost 50 years, and I'm sure those who worked in the Senate know there are unwritten rules in Washington and more important than the written ones. And if a candidate is accepting donations, they're large donations, he knows who's helped him financially. They're the ones who get access, the ones who will have meetings with first. And without having an express commitment made that they will do certain things, you'll find a very close correlation between how a legislator acts and who gave him money in the campaign, or if not gave him direct money, engaged in independent expenditures on their behalf. That is how Washington works. That's why the money comes in. It's not altruism in politics. The money comes in for a reason, because the people who give believe they'll get something in return. If it's not a policy issue, most of the time it's something that has an economic backing to it in some sense, a subsidy, a tax break, a tariff, quotas, government contract, anyway, a variety of things that have economic impacts here.
What does that mean for candidates these days? We see that being practiced in politics over the past few years, whether it is regarding the domestic politics, for example, some of the very controversial issues on abortion, immigrants, and many others. Also on international policies, for example, the Nancy Pelosi's insisting of visiting Taiwan at a time when politics could be very disturbing. So how do you see politicians or candidates for politics trying to make their point no matter what the consequences could be?
Well, let me go directly at the point that you raised, which I think is really important. If we just focus on the extremists in the Republican Party, I think we miss something that's going on in American politics. In our world of social media and the entire media just being so fractured right now, I think that politicians more and more have to do things that are cutting edge. I mean, that are pushing the envelope to get attention. And what you mentioned with Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan, I think is one of those. If she had just gone to Korea, if she had just gone to Singapore and Japan, it probably would have gotten very little or no coverage in American media. But by going to Taiwan, it guaranteed huge coverage for the entire trip, not only through the American media, but it guaranteed that the Chinese Foreign Ministry would respond, and it would make it an even bigger story. I think more and more politicians realize that they have to talk loudly and really even talk about some things that they might not have talked about before to get attention. It's just very hard. I've been at so many press conferences on Capitol Hill over the years that weren't very newsworthy. But now I think that the topics become more and more politically charged and emotionally charged. And whether it's Republicans trying to ban all abortions, even in cases of rape or incest or threat to the health of the mother, or with Democrats and some of the tax the rich kinds of schemes that have been proposed in this election year.
Yeah, well, I think the politics in general in the United States have taken a vertical plunge. We become much more tribalist and divisive, extreme, and not focusing on what is the heart and soul of the United States. It's an idea about process. It's an idea about separation of powers, an idea about how we go about achieving justice. If we lose, we go back and we argue. We don't engage in rebellion, crime, violence, intimidation, which is what we witnessed in spades on January 6th. And it's frightening to me, having lived what I thought was the end of a real quest to overthrow the rule of law in Watergate, and having President Nixon resign because he was obstructing justice, to see, the equanimity with which even the United States today has viewed this effort. And I was literally within 50 yards of ground zero in January 6th. My offices are right near the Congress building, and 140 policemen being heard and badgered. This was a clear attempt to prevent Vice President Mike Pence from counting the electoral votes to make President Biden president. And there can't be any doubt about that. Anybody who was there open their eyes and see all the blood and the policemen who were battered. And that is the greatest danger the United States confronts, is that we'll walk away from process and look about results. As we had Thomas Jefferson said, we shouldn't undertake great innovations on slender majorities. We're all Americans at heart. We believe in the Constitution of the United States, peaceful transfer of power. And if we don't come to a consensus on that, then we are not long for being a superpower. We will fall into self-ruination, whether it's civil war or something else. A country cannot stand divided against itself between peace and peaceful voting as deciding where power lies, as opposed to AK-47s and violence.
Bruce Fein, Rick Dunham, Brandon Andrews, thank you so much, gentlemen. I learned a lot about the latest in the U.S. And that's all the time we have for today. You can find us on Twitter, YouTube, and also on Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us.